Lenora Pike slammed her fist on the wooden table so hard that every cup rattled. "That woman poisoned my child." She said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. Loud enough that old Earl Simmons dropped his pipe. Loud enough that 3 women by the window turned and covered their mouths. And every single person in that hall believed her. Because fear doesn't ask for proof. Fear just listens. But here's what Lenora never told them. She had eaten Rosalie Mercer's soup not 3 days before. She'd had 2 bowls. Asked for a third. Now she stood there pointing a finger, and nobody in that room remembered any of it. If that were you, your food on that table, your hands that made it, your name being dragged through the mud, what would you do? This is the story of a woman who fed an entire valley while that same valley tried to destroy her. Before we go further, if stories like this one speak to something real in you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The first time Rosalie Mercer came home with mud up to her shins and a basket full of plants. Nobody recognized. Silas didn't say a word. He just looked at her boots, looked at the basket, and went back to sharpening his plow blade. That was his way. Not cruel, not dismissive. Just quiet in the particular way that men of that era were taught to be quiet when something bothered them, which was most things, most of the time. Rosalie set the basket on the kitchen table and pulled out a handful of flat, tender leaves. She held one up to the afternoon light coming through the window. Satisfied with something she saw there, she nodded to herself and turned to the stove. What is that?" Silas said. Not a question exactly, more like a thought he didn't mean to say out loud. "Lamb's quarters," she said. "Creek bank's full of them this time of year. Tastes like spinach, but better." Silas didn't respond. He set his whetstone down and washed his hands at the basin, and by the time supper was on the table, he ate what she put in front of him without complaint. The greens were cooked with a little salt pork and vinegar. They were good. He didn't say so. Rosalie noticed. She always noticed. But she had long since learned that Silas showing up to the table, eating without complaint, and not leaving half his plate, that was his version of a compliment. She accepted it and moved on. That was 1887, in the farming valley of Millhaven, Pennsylvania, and their marriage had a language all its own. What Rosalie hadn't told Silas, what she hadn't told anyone really, was that she had been studying wild plants since she was 11 years old. Her grandmother had taught her, not in a formal way, not with books or lessons written down, but the way all the most important knowledge gets passed between women in that time. In the early morning, before the men woke up, walking the edge of the property with a sharp eye and a careful hand. Her grandmother had been the kind of woman people called eccentric, which was another word for knowledgeable in ways that made comfortable people uncomfortable. Rosalie had inherited the knowledge and, apparently, the reputation. She was 34 years old, heavy-set in the way that women of real physical labor often are. Not soft, not fragile, but solid in a way that spoke to years of hauling water and lifting grain sacks and doing work that didn't make it into the church bulletin because it happened before sunrise and after dark. Her hands were rough. Her hair was always slightly undone by noon. She walked with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who has never needed to perform herself for an audience. The women of Millhaven Valley had never quite known what to do with her. She didn't attend the quilting circles with any regularity. She didn't gossip in the satisfying way that made afternoon visits feel productive. She was friendly enough when you spoke to her, but she had a way of listening to you very directly that could feel uncomfortable if you weren't used to it, like she was actually hearing what you said instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. And then there was the matter of her size. In a community where a woman's respectability was measured in part by the tidiness of her appearance and the severity of her self-discipline, Rosalie was a perpetual source of quiet judgment. She wasn't unaware of it. She had simply, at some point in her early 20s, decided that the opinions of women who counted her biscuits were not opinions she was obligated to carry around with her. This was easier decided than lived, but she was practiced at it. The neighbor who lived closest to their east fence was a woman named Lenora Pike. Lenora was narrow in the way some people are narrow, not just physically, but in her vision, in her sympathies, in the range of human behavior she was willing to tolerate before deciding a person was a problem. She kept her yard immaculate. She kept her opinions immaculate too, well-pressed, carefully arranged, always ready to be displayed. She had 2 daughters who were beautiful in a conventional way, and a husband who worked hard and said little, and she had appointed herself somewhere along the line as the Valley's informal arbiter of what was proper. Rosalie Mercer was not proper, and Lenora Pike had never forgiven her for it. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment at the dry goods store. "I saw your neighbor out by the creek again, picking at things like a goat," delivered with a smile that made the recipient unsure whether to laugh along or object. A word dropped here and there at Sunday meeting. The careful kind of poison that doesn't leave a mark because it goes in so slowly. By the spring of 1887, there was a settled understanding in Millhaven Valley that Rosalie Mercer was odd, that her habits were embarrassing to her husband, who was a good man and deserved better, that the plants she gathered were at best useless and at worst suspicious, that a woman her size clearly didn't need to be eating any additional things. Rosalie heard some of it directly. Most of it reached her the way most things reach a person in a small community, sideways, softened by the messenger, but unmistakable in its shape. She didn't stop going to the creek. She went more, actually. That spring she had mapped nearly 3 miles of the bank and knew exactly where the purslane grew thickest, where the wild onion came up in clusters so dense you could harvest a full pound in 10 minutes, where the nettles were most tender before they stiffened in the summer heat. Silas watched her come home with her baskets and her muddy boots and her quiet satisfaction, and he felt the complicated mixture of love and embarrassment that is, perhaps, the most honest description of long marriage. He loved her. Genuinely, uncomplicated at its core, the way you love someone who has made you better without ever making you feel small for having needed improving. But he also wished, on the days when he went to Hatcher's Feed and Supply and felt the other men's eyes slide toward him in a particular way, that she would just be a little less visible about it. He never said this to her directly. He was not a dishonest man, but he was a conflict-avoiding one, which amounts to the same thing over enough years. What he said instead one evening in early May was, "You know folks talk." Rosalie was sorting through a bundle of nettles, wearing her heavy gloves, setting aside the stems. "I know," she said. "It doesn't bother you." "It bothers me some," she said. "Doesn't change anything." He sat across from her at the table and watched her work. "Lenora Pike told Mrs. Hatcher you were teaching our girls bad habits." "We don't have girls," Rosalie said. "I know that. That's the point. She talks, Rosalie. She talks a lot." Rosalie set down a bundle of nettles and looked at him. Not angry, just direct, the way she was always direct. "Silas, what is it you want me to do?" He didn't have an answer. He hadn't expected the question that directly. "I can stop going to the creek," she said. "Is that what you're asking?" "No," he said, and he meant it. "I'm not asking you to stop." "Then what?" He exhaled. "I don't know. I don't want you to be the thing people make jokes about." She looked at him for a long moment. Something passed through her face that wasn't quite hurt and wasn't quite anger, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. "Silas," she said quietly, "I've been the thing people make jokes about since before you married me. You knew that." He had. He truly had known it. He'd chosen her anyway, which he still believed was one of the 3 best decisions of his life. But knowing a thing in the abstract and living with its daily weight are different exercises entirely. "I know," he said. "Then let me do my work," she said. And she went back to the nettles. He sat there another minute, feeling the quiet between them, and then he went out to check on the horses. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't the conversation either of them probably needed. But it was the conversation they were capable of having that evening, and sometimes that has to be enough. The summer started dry. This wasn't unusual for the valley, but it was more pronounced than most years. By July, the creek had dropped 2 feet. The topsoil was cracking in the fields. Farmers walked their rows with that particular expression of men who have done everything right and are watching it not be enough. The Mercer cabbage fields were suffering like everyone else's. Silas had planted well, watered where he could, rotated the beds properly. But there was only so much a man could do against weather that had simply decided not to cooperate. Then, in the first week of August, the beetles came. Nobody knew what kind they were exactly, not at first. They appeared one morning on Earl Simmons's barley, small, dark, moving in numbers that made the field look like it was shifting. By afternoon, they had spread to 3 neighboring properties. By the next morning, half the valley was affected. Silas saw them from the edge of his field and felt something cold move through his chest. He'd heard his father describe infestations like this. Once, when Silas was 7, a similar event had taken most of the valley's corn in 4 days. 2 families had left that winter, not because they'd starved, but because they couldn't see a way forward. That kind of loss does something to a person's will that isn't easily recovered. He turned around and walked back to the house. Rosalie was at the kitchen table when he came in. She looked at his face and set her cup down. "How bad?" she said. "Bad," he said. She stood up and walked to the door and looked out at the fields. She stood there a long time without speaking. "Silas," she said finally, "go see what Tom Aldridge is doing. See if the men want to coordinate." "And you?" "I'm going to the creek," she said. He almost said something. He stopped himself. She was already pulling on her work boots. What happened in the days that followed was not dramatic in any visible way. There was no single moment, no grand gesture. Rosalie simply continued. While the men of the valley held emergency meetings at the Grange Hall, trying traditional remedies, digging trenches around fields, applying lime and ash in patterns their grandfathers had recommended, Rosalie walked the creek bank with her baskets. The beetles didn't touch wild plants. She had known this. Plants that had survived in the margins for generations without human cultivation had developed a particular resilience that domestic crops, bred for flavor and yield and nothing else, simply didn't possess. She harvested purslane in quantities she'd never attempted before. She found a patch of wood sorrel she hadn't cataloged yet, half a mile north of her usual range, and picked until her arms ached. She dug wild onion until her back protested. She gathered nettle tops by the careful armful and lamb's quarters by the bushel, and she brought it all home and began to cook. The first pot of soup she made that week was, in her own private assessment, one of the best things she had ever cooked. The wild greens had a depth to them that cultivated vegetables never quite achieved, something mineral and alive that settled into the broth and made it taste like the earth itself had decided to be generous. She ate a bowl at the kitchen table alone because Silas was still at the Grange Hall, and she thought about her grandmother, about the morning walks, about the way her grandmother had said, once, that hunger is a great teacher, but only to the students who were already paying attention. She made 6 more pots over the next 2 days. On the 3rd day, Agnes Whitmore knocked at the door. Agnes was not a close friend, more of a comfortable acquaintance, the kind of neighbor you borrowed a cup of sugar from and returned it without drama. She had 4 children and a husband whose leg had never fully healed from a farming accident 3 years prior, which meant the family's capacity to absorb a crop failure was essentially 0. She stood at the door with her youngest on her hip, and she looked at Rosalie with an expression that cost her something. Rosalie could see it cost her something, and she said, "I heard you had food." "Come in," Rosalie said. "Sit down." Agnes sat. The child sat on her lap and examined Rosalie's kitchen with large, serious eyes. Rosalie put a bowl of soup on the table and a piece of cornbread beside it, and Agnes ate with the careful dignity of someone who was very hungry but had decided not to show it. "It's good," Agnes said. She sounded surprised despite herself. "Lamb's quarters and nettle mostly," Rosalie said. "Wild onion for flavor." Agnes looked at the bowl. "I walked past that creek 100 times," she said. "Most people have." There was a pause. Agnes looked up. "How did you know?" "My grandmother," Rosalie said simply. Agnes nodded slowly. She finished the bowl and accepted a second one. Then she looked at Rosalie with something in her expression that was very close to shame. "I've said things," Agnes said. "About you. About the creek." "I know," Rosalie said. "I'm sorry." Rosalie looked at her, this woman with her tired eyes and her child and her hunger, and felt the particular exhaustion of being owed an apology you never asked for and aren't sure what to do with. "I know," she said again. "It's all right." It wasn't entirely all right, but it was the kind of thing you said because some truths need to be set aside in order to get through the immediate moment, and that is not the same as lying. Agnes left with a bundle of dried lamb's quarters and instructions for using it. 2 hours later, she was back with her eldest daughter, who had a notebook and a serious expression, and asked if Rosalie would show her what to look for at the creek. They went the next morning. 3 women, not 2. Agnes had brought Martha Tillman, who had brought her own basket. Rosalie walked them along the bank and showed them what she saw when she looked at a creekside. The way certain plants clustered, the color of the stem at the base, the smell when you crushed a leaf. She pointed out purslane and explained that people in other parts of the world had eaten it for centuries. She showed them which nettles to take and which to leave. She was patient in the particular way that comes from having tried to explain something difficult to someone who didn't want to hear it, and finding, when someone finally wanted to, that the patience was still there. She didn't think about what this was yet. She was just doing the next necessary thing, the way she had always done. Back in the valley, the crop losses were becoming clearer in their severity. The beetles had moved through most of the cultivated fields like water through sand, not stopping, not slowing, indifferent to human effort or human need. By the second week of August, families that had started the summer with reasonable expectations were doing quiet calculations that came out wrong no matter how you arranged the numbers. The Mercer farm had lost the cabbage. The root vegetables were holding so far, the beetles having shown less interest in them, but Silas didn't know how far that would extend. He sat at the table one evening and laid out what they had and what they owed and what they'd need to get through to spring, and when he was done, the numbers were bad but not catastrophic. Not yet. He looked up and found Rosalie watching him. "We'll manage," she said. "We will," he agreed. Then, with some effort, "The soup's good." She looked at him for a moment. "Silas Boone," she said, "did you just admit my cooking is good?" Something relaxed in his face. "Don't push it," he said. She laughed. It was the first time either of them had laughed in 2 weeks, and the sound of it in the kitchen did something for both of them that no amount of careful arithmetic could have done. But outside their door, the valley was tightening. Lenora Pike had not come to Rosalie's kitchen. She had not sent her daughters. She had not knocked at the door or crossed the east fence or acknowledged by any gesture that her neighbor had something she needed. What she had done instead was start a different kind of campaign, quieter, more deliberate, the kind that doesn't make noise until it's already done its damage. She told her husband that evening, setting his supper on the table with precise, angry movements, that she would eat grass before she went begging to that woman. Her husband, who was practiced at surviving Lenora's emphatic statements by going very still and eating quickly, said nothing. She told her neighbor on the north side, Mrs. Clary, that there was something unsettling about a woman who'd spent years collecting plants nobody could identify, and suddenly, now, was feeding the whole valley, like she'd been preparing for something, like she'd known. Mrs. Clary thought that was an odd thing to say, but she was hungry, and Mrs. Clary had a particular weakness for a compelling narrative, especially one that reframed her own embarrassment as justified suspicion. She didn't go to Rosalie's door either, but her daughter did 3 days later, when the pantry was genuinely bare, and Rosalie fed her without a word about her mother, which in its own way was the most devastating response Lenora could have received, though she would never admit it. The valley was surviving. Barely, unevenly, with the particular grace of people who have been forced to set aside pride in service of the more fundamental goal of not watching their children go to bed hungry. Rosalie moved through it like she moved through everything. Without performance, without expectation, just the next task and the next and the next. She was tired. She was more tired than she let Silas see. Her hands hurt from the constant harvesting. She was waking before 4 every morning to get to the creek before the heat. She was cooking in quantities that taxed their firewood. She had lost weight she hadn't intended to lose, which was not an entirely comfortable thing for a woman who had spent years defining herself against the commentary about her body, to suddenly find her body smaller because of deprivation, which felt like a kind of surrender, even though it wasn't. Late one night, after the fire was banked and Silas was asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her rough hands around a cup of cold tea, and she let herself feel the full weight of it for the first time. She was tired. She was angry, in a way she had not let herself be during the daylight hours, when being angry would have been a distraction from being useful. She was angry at the years of comments about her weight, at the years of jokes about the weeds, at Lenora Pike's face, which she had seen at the church 2 Sundays ago, wearing the expression of a woman who was keeping her own counsel and finding it very satisfying. She was angry at Silas, just a little, for all the evenings he had come home from the feed store carrying other men's opinions in his posture. She knew he loved her. She knew he had never asked her to stop. But love and support are different things, and she had often felt very loved and somewhat unsupported. And in the honest quiet of a late August night, with her hands aching and the valley asleep outside her window, she allowed herself to know that. Then she finished the cold tea and went to bed. Because there was another morning coming, and the creek would need walking, and there were families counting on what her hands knew how to do. That was the truth of Rosalie Mercer, and it was not a comfortable truth or a simple one. She was not the woman others would have written in a story. She was tired and angry, and sometimes lonely, and her hands hurt, and she kept going anyway, not because she was exceptional, but because she had decided a long time ago that the alternative was to be ordinary in a way she couldn't live with. What she did not know, what none of them knew in that third week of August, was that the worst of it hadn't happened yet. The child who would upend everything was already sick. The child's name was Thomas Whitmore. He was 6 years old, Agnes's youngest, the same one who had sat on his mother's hip and watched Rosalie's kitchen with those large, serious eyes while his mother ate her first bowl of soup. He had a gap between his front teeth and a habit of collecting interesting rocks and leaving them in his mother's apron pockets without explanation. And he had been running a fever for 3 days before Agnes finally admitted to herself that it wasn't going away on its own. By the time she told anyone, the fever had climbed high enough that the child was talking to people who weren't in the room. Agnes sat beside his bed and wrung out cloth after cloth in cool water and pressed them to his forehead and tried not to let her hand shake where he could see them. Her husband Robert sat in the corner of the room with his bad leg stretched out and his hands clasped between his knees, and the expression of a man who is doing the worst possible thing a person can be asked to do, which is wait and be useless at the same time. Their eldest daughter, Clara, had run 3 miles to fetch Dr. Harlan Morse, who was the only doctor serving the valley and 3 townships beyond it, and who therefore arrived at most emergencies slightly too late and slightly too out of breath. He examined Thomas with the careful efficiency of a man who had seen a great many sick children and had learned to keep his face neutral because parents' read faces and a doctor's face in a sick child's room is its own kind of diagnosis. When he came out of the bedroom and closed the door behind him, Agnes was standing in the kitchen with her hands pressed flat against the table like she needed something to hold on to. "Summer fever," Dr. Morse said. "It's been moving through the county. 3 other children in the Aldridge Township last week, 2 over in Cartwell." "Will he be all right?" Agnes said. Not a question, a demand. "He's strong," the doctor said. Which was the thing doctors said when they meant, "I don't know yet, but I'm not ready to say the other thing." Agnes knew it. She accepted it because she had no alternative. "What do I do?" she said. "Keep him cool. Keep him drinking whatever he'll take. Don't let the fever climb higher than it already is." He paused. "Is he eating?" "Barely. A little broth." The doctor nodded. "Keep trying. His body needs something to work with." He picked up his bag and looked at her with the particular weariness of a man who had been delivering bad news in careful language for 30 years. "Send for me again if it gets worse. Otherwise, give it time. Some fevers break on their own." He left. The door closed. Agnes stood in her kitchen alone for a long moment, and then she sat down on the floor, right there between the table and the stove, and pressed her face into her apron and cried in complete silence for 3 minutes, because the children were in the other room, and she had decided, somewhere in her early motherhood, that they would not see her fall apart. Then she stood up, washed her face at the basin, and went back to her son's bedside. What happened next was not Agnes's fault, though she would spend a considerable portion of the following month believing it was. She had mentioned Thomas's illness at the creek that morning, before she knew how serious it was, before the fever had climbed, when it still seemed like the ordinary kind of sick that children moved through and came out the other side of. She had mentioned it to Martha Tillman, who was gathering with her, and to 2 other women who had started joining the morning creek walks in the 3rd week of August. She had also mentioned, in passing, that Thomas had eaten particularly well the night before, that he'd had 2 bowls of the lamb's quarters soup and seemed to enjoy it. This was an innocent observation. It was the kind of thing a mother says about a sick child, tracking every variable, trying to find a pattern that makes sense of something that has no pattern. Martha Tillman had not passed it on with any malicious intent. She had mentioned it to her sister-in-law Ruth, also without malice, as part of a longer conversation about how the valley was managing and which families were struggling most. Ruth Tillman had a way of listening to information that was more like collecting it, storing it up, seeing where it might fit. She wasn't a cruel woman, but she was the kind of woman who was more comfortable when things had explanations, and a sick child in a summer of strange weed soup was the beginning of an explanation that required very little effort to assemble. She said nothing immediately. She filed it away. 3 days later, when Thomas's fever was still climbing and the whole valley knew about it because news in a small community moves through shared anxiety the way water moves through cracked clay, Ruth mentioned what she knew at the Grange Hall meeting. She didn't say Rosalie had poisoned the child. She was more careful than that. She said that it was interesting timing, wasn't it, given that so many people had been eating unfamiliar plants recently. She said she didn't know enough about wild greens to know what was safe and what wasn't. She said she supposed most things were probably fine, but children were more sensitive, weren't they? And maybe someone with more knowledge ought to look into it. She looked at nobody in particular when she said it. But Lenora Pike was in the room, and Lenora had been waiting, with the patience of someone who has been waiting a long time and has learned to look occupied while she does it, for exactly this kind of opening. She didn't speak immediately. She let Ruth's words settle. She let the silence sit there and do its quiet work. Then she said carefully that she had always had reservations about the whole arrangement, that she respected everyone's right to make their own choices, but that she personally had never been comfortable with the idea of feeding her family plants that hadn't been properly identified by anyone with actual training, that she hoped the child would recover, she truly did, and that she wasn't saying anything definitive, but the word "but" did the rest. By the time the meeting ended, a thing had been set in motion that had no single author and no clear moment of origin. It was the kind of thing that grows in the space between what people say and what they mean, in the gap between concern and accusation, in the fertile ground of communities under stress, where fear needs somewhere to land, and a convenient target is more comforting than the honest admission that sometimes bad things happen and there is no one to blame. Rosalie didn't know any of this yet. She was at the creek. She had been there since before first light, moving along the bank with a lantern in one hand and her largest basket on her arm, working a section she hadn't fully harvested yet. She was thinking about the root stores, calculating what they had dried and what still needed processing, running the numbers in her head with the grinding practicality of someone who has been managing scarcity so long it has become its own kind of fluency. She was thinking about Thomas Whitmore, too. Agnes had told her about the fever the previous morning, and Rosalie had sent over a container of strong nettle broth, which was the thing her grandmother had always given feverish children, not because it was medicine, but because it was dense with the kind of nourishment a sick body needed and couldn't always hold on to. She didn't know whether Agnes had used it. She hoped so. She would go by this afternoon to check. She was turning this over in her mind when she heard someone coming along the bank behind her. She turned and found Clara Whitmore, Agnes's eldest, picking her way carefully over the creek stones. Clara was 14 and serious in the way that the eldest child of a struggling family is often serious. She had been doing adult calculations since she was 10, and it showed in the set of her jaw and the directness of her eyes. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. "Clara." Rosalie straightened. "How's your brother?" "Worse," Clara said. Her voice was flat in the way that meant she was working very hard to keep it flat. "Mama sent me. She wanted to know if there was anything else, anything in the broth that might help." "The broth is what I'd give him," Rosalie said. "Is he drinking it?" "A little. He won't keep much down." Rosalie looked at the girl, this 14-year-old standing on a creek bank in the gray early morning, trying to be useful in the only way available to her, and made a decision. "Come with me," she said. "I want to show you something." She took Clara further along the bank to a cluster of plants she had identified 2 weeks earlier but hadn't harvested yet. They were small and low to the ground, with rounded leaves and a faint particular smell. "Boneset," Rosalie said. "My grandmother used it for fever." "Not the leaves, just a tea from the stems and flowers. Small amounts, weak tea, nothing strong." She paused. "I'm not a doctor. I won't tell you it's medicine, but it's what I'd make if he were mine." Clara crouched down and looked at the plant with careful attention. "How do you know it's safe?" "I've been watching it since I was 11, Rosalie said. "And I've made mistakes with plants before, Clara. Not with this one." She sat back and let that land. She thought it was important that the girl hear that, the part about mistakes. She had always believed that confidence built on a foundation of admitted error was the only kind worth having. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she pulled a small knife from her apron pocket. The same knife, Rosalie noticed, that she'd used the previous week when Rosalie had been teaching her to cut lamb's quarters, and began carefully harvesting the bone-set stems. They walked back together along the bank. By the time they reached the point where the path split toward the Whitmore farm, Clara had a small bundle of stems wrapped in a cloth and a set of instructions she had repeated back twice to make sure she had them right. "Tell your mother to send word if it gets worse," Rosalie said. "I will," Clara said. She hesitated at the split in the path. "Mrs. Mercer, people are saying things." "What kind of things?" The girl looked down at her boots. "About the food. About whether it might have made him sick." Rosalie was quiet for a long moment. The creek moved behind them, and somewhere up the bank a kingfisher made its short, sharp cry. "Do you believe that?" Rosalie asked. Clara looked up. "No," she said. "I don't think that." "Good," Rosalie said simply. "Go home to your brother." She watched the girl go. Then she stood at the path fork alone in the early morning with her basket and her lantern and the information Clara had just handed her, and she let herself feel what that information felt like before she had to do anything about it. It felt the way she'd known it would feel, which was the worst part. There was a terrible familiarity to it, the shape of it, the timing, the way it had arrived, not through direct accusation, but through a 14-year-old girl looking at her boots. She had known, in some part of herself she'd been trying not to listen to, that something like this was coming, that the Valley's gratitude was conditional, that the same community that had knocked on her door with empty hands would, under sufficient pressure, need someone to be responsible for the pressure itself. She wasn't surprised. She was tired. She picked up her basket and walked home. Silas was already up when she got back, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had been waiting. "I heard something at the Grange last night," he said, before she'd even taken her boots off. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know already." "Clara Whitmore told me this morning." He put his cup down. "Rosalie, it's all right," she said. She set her basket on the table and began unpacking it with steady hands. "The child has a summer fever. The doctor said there were cases in 3 other townships. It has nothing to do with the food." "I know that," Silas said. I know that." He was quiet for a moment. "But people are talking, and it's getting—" He stopped. "It's getting louder," she said. "Yes." She laid out the morning's harvest. Purslane, lamb's quarters, a handful of wood sorrel, the bone set she'd kept separate from the rest. She looked at it all arranged on the table. Weeks of knowledge, weeks of work, weeks of feeding people who had spent years making jokes about her. And she felt the anger move through her cleanly, like water. "What do you want me to do?" she said. Same question she had asked him in the spring. Different weight to it now. "I don't know," he said. Same answer. But this time he said it differently. Not with the vague discomfort of a man who wishes things were simpler, but with the honest bewilderment of one who genuinely doesn't know how to help the person he loves navigate something he can't fix. "I could stop," she said. "Stop bringing food to people. Stop the creek walks. Keep to ourselves until it dies down." He was quiet. "Or I could keep going," she said, "and let them say what they say." "If you stop," Silas said carefully, "some of those families are going to go hungry. The Simmons, the Crenshaws, the Aldridges, they're already down to almost nothing." "I know. And if you keep going, Lenora Pike is going to—" "She's going to keep at it, Rosalie. She's not going to let it go." "I know that too." He looked at her across the table, across the harvest she'd laid out between them, and she saw in his face the particular effort of a man who has spent most of his marriage just slightly failing the woman he loves, and has finally, under sufficient weight, decided to try harder. "Then keep going," he said. "I'll go to the Grange tonight. I'll talk to Tom Aldridge and some of the others. Men whose families you've fed. They'll speak up." She looked at him for a moment. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." A pause. "Past due, probably." She didn't say anything to that. She just nodded, once, and that was enough between them. The anonymous letters started 2 days later. The first one appeared under their door on a Tuesday morning. A single folded sheet of paper with no signature, the handwriting blocky and deliberate, the kind of script someone uses when they're trying not to be recognized. It said that the Valley's families had been trusting a woman with no medical training, no formal knowledge, and no accountability, and that someone needed to ask harder questions about what exactly had been in that food, and whether it had contributed to the illness of an innocent child. Rosalie read it at the kitchen table with her morning tea. Then she folded it back up and set it at the edge of the table and drank the rest of her tea and went about her morning. Silas came in from the barn and saw the letter and picked it up and read it, and his jaw tightened in a way she'd only seen twice in their marriage. Once when a neighboring farmer had shorted him on a cattle deal, and once when a man at the feed store had said something about Rosalie that he hadn't told her the exact content of. Cowardly, he said. Frightened, she said. Same thing sometimes. Sometimes, she agreed. He set the letter down with more force than it warranted, given that it was only paper. You know who wrote this? I don't, she said. I have thoughts. Lenora Pike. I don't know that. You think it. She looked at him. What I think doesn't help either of us. He paced to the window and back. This was new, the pacing. Silas was not a pacer. He was a man who sat with things, who went still under pressure. The pacing told her something was moving in him that hadn't moved before. I want to go over there, he said. I want to knock on that door and… No, she said, quiet but absolute. He stopped, looked at her. No, she said again, not that. Not now. It's what she'd want, to make it ugly and direct and something the whole valley could see and take sides on. She paused. We don't give her that. Then what do we give her? Rosalie looked at the letter on the table. Nothing, she said. We give her nothing, and we keep feeding people. He stood there breathing for a moment, working through it. Then he nodded, sat down, picked up his coffee. Second letter comes, he said. I'm going to Tom Aldridge. Fair enough, she said. There was no second letter. There were 3 more. They arrived over the next 4 days, each one slightly more specific than the last. The second mentioned that wild plants could carry parasites and contaminants that cultivated plants did not. The third questioned whether the lamb's quarters had been properly identified, or whether certain toxic look-alike species might have been confused in the harvest. The fourth was the worst. It said, with the particular cruelty of carefully chosen words, that a woman who had spent years on the margins of the community feeding her ego with unconventional habits had now positioned herself as indispensable during a crisis, and that the community should ask itself what kind of person needed to be needed that badly. Rosalie read that one and set it face down on the table without folding it. She sat with it for a long time, because that one had found something. She wouldn't have said so to Silas, wouldn't have said so to anyone, but some part of her understood that the worst accusations are the ones that find even a small foothold, not because they're true, but because they're adjacent to something you've already wondered about yourself. Had she needed this? The crisis, the purpose, the feeling of being useful in a way that was finally visible? She had always told herself she gathered wild plants because her grandmother taught her, and because it made practical sense. But had there been something else in it? Some satisfaction in the knowledge that she possessed something the valley couldn't access without her? She sat with that question for 20 minutes, which was longer than she'd sat with anything in weeks. Then she thought about Agnes Whitmore on her kitchen floor, crying into her apron because her son was sick and she had nothing to give him. She thought about Clara on the creek bank with her careful eyes and her small knife. She thought about the 6-year-old with the gap in his teeth, leaving rocks in his mother's apron pockets. She stood up, picked up the letter, folded it, and added it to the others in the box she'd started keeping on the high shelf, and went to the creek. Thomas Whitmore's fever broke on a Thursday. Rosalie didn't hear about it immediately. She heard about something else first. Silas came home from the Grange on Thursday evening, looking like a man who had been in a fight he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he'd won. He sat down heavily in the chair by the fire and rubbed his face with both hands. "Tell me," she said. "The meeting was bad," he said. Tom Aldridge spoke up. Harold Simmons spoke up. A few others. He paused. Lenora Pike spoke up longer. Rosalie sat down across from him. "What did she say?" "She said…" He stopped, started again. "She's saying you've been giving people food nobody can verify is safe, that you've been positioning yourself as some kind of authority on wild plants when you have no training, that the whole community has been putting their trust in a woman who…" He stopped again. "Who what?" Rosalie said. He looked at her. "Who has never shown good judgment about her own choices, so why should anyone trust her judgment about theirs?" The room was very quiet. "She said that," Rosalie said, "more or less, in front of Tom Aldridge and Harold Simmons." and 12 other men and 6 women and the Grange secretary who writes everything down. Rosalie sat very still. The fire popped. Outside, the late August dark sat heavy against the windows. "What did Tom Aldridge say?" she said. He told her that his family had eaten Rosalie Mercer's food for 2 weeks, and they were all standing fine, and he'd take her judgment over a woman who'd never set foot on a creek bank in her life. Silas paused. Harold Simmons said something similar but louder. And Lenora. She said she hoped they were right. He looked at the fire. The way she said it made it sound like she hoped they were wrong. Rosalie looked at her husband, at the lines around his eyes that had deepened over the past 3 weeks, at his hands, which were scarred and calloused and had done 30 years of honest work. "Silas," she said. "Yeah. Are you all right?" He looked at her like the question surprised him. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." He rubbed his face again. "I got into it with Pete Crenshaw outside after. He was saying things. About you. About your—" He gestured vaguely toward her. "About how you look. About whether someone who can't manage their own—" He stopped. "I'm not repeating it." "You didn't hit him." "I didn't hit him." A pause. "I thought about it." "Silas." "I know. I didn't." He looked at his hands. "I said some things instead. Things I meant." "What kind of things?" "I said that Pete Crenshaw had eaten bread made from grain my wife identified and processed and delivered to his door, and that the next time he wanted to make comments about her, he should do it on an empty stomach so he could feel the difference." He paused. "I said some other things too. They were less polite." Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. She was not going to cry. She was too tired to cry and too private to do it in front of him anyway. But something shifted in her chest, something that had been held at a particular angle for a very long time, and she was aware of it shifting. "Thank you," she said. "Past due," he said. Same words as before. He meant them more now. She reached across and put her hand over his for a moment. He turned his hand over and held it. They sat like that for a while, not talking, the fire burning down between them. The next morning, Agnes Whitmore came to the door. Rosalie opened it and found her standing there looking like she'd been awake for a week, which she had, but also looking like something had been lifted off her. Her eyes were red and her hair was only half pinned and she was crying before she'd said a single word. "He broke," Agnes said. "The fever broke last night. He woke up asking for food." Rosalie let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "He asked for your soup," Agnes said. She half laughed, half sobbed. "First thing he said, he wanted the soup with the green things." Rosalie put her arms around the woman and Agnes gripped her back like she needed something to hold, which she did, and they stood in the doorway for a moment that wasn't elegant or composed, but was entirely real. "Thank you," Agnes said into her shoulder. "The bone-set tea. Sometimes I sit on the kitchen floor." Agnes laughed, a startled, wet laugh that she hadn't expected to make. "I did that," she said. "This week, right there, floor." "I know," Rosalie said. "It helps." Agnes left an hour later with a container of soup, lamb's quarters, and wild onion, and a marrow bone Rosalie had been saving, for Thomas, who had asked for the soup with the green things. Rosalie stood at the door and watched her go, and felt, for the first time in several days, something that wasn't quite optimism, but was adjacent to it. The feeling didn't last the afternoon. What ended it was a knock at the door at 2:30. When Rosalie opened it, she found not a neighbor and not a friend, but Lenora Pike standing on her front step. It was the first time Lenora had ever come to her door. In 10 years of neighboring, in 10 years of comments and sideways glances and carefully constructed social distance, Lenora Pike had never once stood on Rosalie Mercer's front step. The fact that she was doing so now, in the middle of a controversy she had substantially shaped, meant something. Rosalie was not immediately sure what. "Lenora," she said. Lenora looked at her the way she always looked at her, assessing, composed, wearing the particular expression of a woman who has decided in advance how a conversation is going to go. "I want to talk to you," Lenora said. "All right." Rosalie stepped back. "Come in." "I'd rather talk out here." Of course she would, because inside was private and outside was observable. And Lenora had understood since she was very young that the audience changes what a conversation means. "All right," Rosalie said, She stepped out onto the step and pulled the door partly closed behind her. "What is it?" Lenora was quiet for a moment. She folded her hands in front of her in a way that looked composed, but if you were watching carefully, cost her something. "The Whitmore child is better," she said. "I know," Rosalie said. "I'm glad of it." She said it like she meant it, which Rosalie thought was probably true. Lenora Pike was not, she believed, a person who wished illness on children. She was a person who used information and fear as tools, which was its own kind of harm, but it was a different kind. "I've been thinking," Lenora said, "about what I've said in the past weeks." Rosalie said nothing. She waited. "I haven't said anything untrue," Lenora said, with the careful precision of someone selecting words like she's diffusing something. There were legitimate questions to be asked, about safety, about accountability. Anyone in the community would have had the right to raise those questions. "They would," Rosalie said, carefully neutral. Lenora looked at her. Something moved in her face that she controlled quickly. "You're not going to make this easy." "I'm not sure what you want me to make easy, Lenora." Another silence. The afternoon light fell between them on the step, and somewhere down the lane one of the Simmons children was calling to another, the voice carrying thin and clear in the dry August air. "I want," Lenora started, stopped. "I thought it was important to come and—" "Are you apologizing?" Rosalie asked. She kept her voice even. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She genuinely didn't know the answer and thought it was relevant. Lenora's jaw tightened. "I'm saying that perhaps some of the concern I expressed was—" a pause. "Was disproportionate to the available evidence at the time." Rosalie looked at this woman. This narrow, immaculate, relentlessly managing woman who had spent 10 years making her the Valley's convenient joke, and who was now standing on her step trying to find the smallest possible words for something that would have required large words to say properly. She thought about the letters, about Pete Crenshaw outside the Grange, about Silas's hands, about Agnes on the kitchen floor, about Clara Whitmore on a creek bank at night with a lantern and a small knife. She thought about what it would feel like to say the true thing, to say, "Lenora, you let people go hungry because you didn't want to admit I had something you needed. And then when a child got sick, you handed that fear a name, and the name was mine. And you did it standing in a room full of people who trusted your judgment, and you used that trust to protect yourself from being embarrassed." She thought about what it would feel like. Then she thought about what it would accomplish. "Thank you for coming," Rosalie said. Lenora blinked. That was not what she had expected. "The fever's broken," Rosalie continued. "The doctor will confirm the cause was nothing in this valley's food supply. And there are families that still need feeding before the summer's out. So if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." She went back inside. She stood in her kitchen with her back against the closed door and her eyes on the ceiling and breathed in and out for a long moment. Then she went to the stove. She had 8 families' worth of greens to process before dark. Elderly Mabel Crow, who lived 2 miles east and had no family left in the valley, had sent word through the Simmons children that her stores were running low. Rosalie had promised to walk over that evening with enough food to last the old woman through the week. Mabel Crow was 81 years old and almost entirely forgotten by everyone in the valley except Rosalie, who had been bringing her things since the previous winter when she had noticed, on a chance visit, that the old woman's cupboards held very little and her pride held very much. Rosalie put on her apron, measured out her greens, lit the stove. Outside, in the valley, people were still talking. The letters were still in their box on the high shelf. Lenora Pike was walking back down the lane to her own house with her hands still folded and her jaw still set, and whatever she had come for not quite obtained. And a 6-year-old boy with a gap in his teeth was sitting up in his bed asking for soup with green things in it, which was, in the particular arithmetic of this valley, in the particular summer of 1887, as close to a verdict as anything else that had happened. The evening came in slow and amber. Rosalie finished the processing, wrapped the portions for Mabel, wrapped the portions for 2 other households she'd promised, and cleaned her kitchen until it was ready for the next morning's work. Then she put on her coat, picked up her basket, and walked out into the dusk. 2 miles east. An old woman who was hungry and alone and had never in her life asked anyone for help. That was the battle in front of her. That was always the battle in front of her. She walked until the farmhouse lights behind her were small, and the dark ahead was wide and the basket in her hand was heavy, in the good way, the way that meant something was in it that someone needed. She kept walking. Mabel Crow's house smelled like old wood and dried lavender, and something underneath both of those things that Rosalie had learned over the past year of visits was simply the smell of a place where one person had lived alone for a very long time. The old woman was awake when Rosalie knocked, which was not always the case. She was sitting in the chair closest to the window with a quilt across her lap and a candle burning on the table beside her, and she looked up when the door opened with an expression that moved quickly from surprise to relief to something she immediately covered with a more composed face. Mabel Crow did not like being caught waiting for someone. Even at 81, even alone, she maintained the particular dignity of a woman who had decided that need was something you managed privately. "You're late," she said. "I know," Rosalie said. "I'm sorry." She set the basket on the table and began unpacking it. "I had company this afternoon." "What kind of company?" "Lenora Pike came to my door." Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did she want?" "I'm still not entirely sure," Rosalie said honestly. She unpacked the soup, enough for 4 days, sealed in one of the crockery containers she'd started using for deliveries, and a parcel of dried lamb's quarters, and a small loaf of bread she'd made that morning from the last of their winter flour supply. She arranged it on Mabel's table with the practical efficiency of someone who has done this enough times to know the old woman would reorganize it exactly as she wished once Rosalie left, but who arranged it anyway because it was something she could do. "Sit down," Mabel said. "Don't hover." Rosalie sat. Mabel looked at her in the candlelight with the particular directness of someone who has been alive long enough to consider the careful management of other people's feelings an optional courtesy. "You look like you've been run over," she said. "I feel like it some," Rosalie admitted. "The valley's talking about you." "Yes." "Saying you poisoned the Whitmore boy." "Not saying it directly. Say things they want to say without the responsibility of having said them." Mabel made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Same thing, just slower." She adjusted the quilt across her lap. "The boy's better." "He is. Agnes came to tell me this morning." "Good." A pause. "You brought him the bone-set tea." Rosalie looked at her. "How did you know that?" "Clara Whitmore came past here 2 days ago. Said she'd learned it from you. She was proud of herself. She should be. That girl has a good head." Mabel looked at this candle. "You know I used bone-set 50 years ago on my youngest. Fever like Thomas had. He made it through." "I didn't know that," Rosalie said. "There are a great many things people don't know," Mabel said, with the particular mild satisfaction of someone who has stopped being bothered by this, because they stopped listening before they heard them. They sat in the companionable quiet that had taken most of a year to build between them. Outside, the August dark was full and settled. An owl called once from somewhere in the trees behind the house and did not call again. Rosalie looked at the old woman's hands on the quilt, small and spotted and very still, but with the particular economy of movement that spoke to hands that had never been idle until age made them so. She thought about her grandmother's hands, about how knowledge traveled through hands, mostly, through touch and repetition and proximity. How much of what she knew had never been written anywhere, had never been in a book, had passed from person to person through exactly these kinds of evenings. "They're going to make it difficult," she said. Not to Mabel specifically, just out loud, the way you say something when you've been carrying it all day and it has finally gotten too heavy. "They've been making it difficult for years," Mabel said. "This is different. Before it was comments, looks. This has names on it. This has letters." Mabel looked at her sharply. "Letters?" "Anonymous, 4 of them." Rosalie laced her fingers together in her lap. "Saying the food isn't safe. Saying I have no right to be trusted. The last one—" She stopped. "What did the last one say?" Rosalie was quiet for a moment. "That I needed to be needed. That I positioned myself in a crisis to make myself important. That the community should ask what kind of person would do that." Mabel was very still. The candle moved slightly in a draft neither of them could locate. "Did it find anything?" Mabel asked. Her voice was careful. Rosalie looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The letter. Did it find anything? In you? A place it fit?" The fire popped in the small grate. Outside, the owl shifted somewhere in the dark. "Some," Rosalie said quietly. Mabel nodded. That's how the worst ones work, she said. They don't invent the fear. They find the one you already had, and they hold it up to the light. So what do you do with it? Rosalie said. You look at it, Mabel said. You look at it straight, and you ask yourself, does this thing they're saying about me change what I actually did? She paused. Did you gather those plants because it made you feel important? No. Did you cook that food because you needed people to need you? No. Did you walk 2 miles to bring soup to an old woman who can't ask for it herself because you needed the credit? Rosalie looked at her. No. Then look at it straight and set it down, Mabel said. The letter was trying to make you doubt the whole tree because of one branch. Don't let it. Rosalie sat with that for a moment. The tightness in her chest that had been there since reading the 4th letter, the one she hadn't entirely been able to dismiss, loosened just slightly. Not entirely, but enough. I need to get back, she said finally. Silas will be waiting. Go, Mabel said. Come Thursday. Thursday, Rosalie agreed. She stood and pulled her coat on. At the door she paused. Mabel, have you been eating the soup, the one from Monday? Yes. All of it? A pause. Most of it. Mabel. Some of it, the old woman said, with the particular dignity of someone who has just admitted to wasting food and considers it nobody's business. I'll bring more Thursday, Rosalie said, and I want to see an empty crock when I get here. You have gotten very bossy, Mabel said, for a woman who used to knock on my door with her hat in her hand. I learned it from you, Rosalie said. She walked back in the dark, the empty basket swinging from her arm, and for the first time in several days she felt something solid under her feet that wasn't just the road. The solid ground lasted until Friday. On Friday morning, Silas came in from the barn before breakfast with his coat still on and shut the kitchen door behind him with unusual care, which was the thing he did when he had news he was trying to figure out how to deliver. Rosalie was at the stove. She turned and looked at him. Just say it, she said. He pulled out the chair and sat down. Tom Aldridge came by at first light. There's a formal complaint been lodged with the county agricultural officer. She set down the spoon she was holding. A complaint. Somebody, he didn't know who or wouldn't say, filed a formal written complaint, claiming unauthorized distribution of unidentified food products to vulnerable families. That the person distributing had no formal training or certification and that the community had been exposed to potential harm. He paused. The county officer is coming out next week to investigate. The kitchen was very quiet. A formal complaint, Rosalie said again. Yes. She thought about the word unauthorized. She thought about the word unidentified. She thought about how language could be assembled like a weapon from entirely ordinary parts, each word reasonable on its own, the violence only apparent in how you put them together. Who has the authority to file something like that, she said. Anyone, technically, if they put it in writing and sign their name to it. So it has a name on it. Has to, legally. Lenora Pike, Rosalie said. Silas said nothing, which was the same as saying yes. She turned back to the stove. She stirred the pot that was on it. She did this for a full minute while the information settled into its permanent place in her understanding of things. When is the officer coming? She said. Tuesday. What does he need to see? Tom didn't know exactly, but he said the best thing you could do is have someone credible speak on your behalf. A doctor. Or someone with standing in the county. He paused. Dr. Morse. Rosalie nodded slowly. Dr. Morse had seen what she'd brought to the Whitmore house. He had seen Thomas before the bone set and after. He had also, 3 weeks prior, quietly visited her kitchen at her invitation and spent an hour examining her harvest, asking careful questions, nodding at answers he found satisfactory. He had said nothing formally, but he had eaten a bowl of her soup before he left, which she had taken as a professional endorsement of the edible variety. I'll go see him today, she said. I'll come with you. She glanced at him over her shoulder. You have the south field to... I'll come with you, he said again. She turned back to the stove. All right. They went together that afternoon, which meant something. Meant it visibly, in the way small communities read the presence or absence of a husband beside his wife as a kind of statement. People they passed on the road noted it. Rosalie was aware of the noting. She did not alter her pace. Dr. Morse was in his office when they arrived. He listened to what Silas told him about the complaint with the same careful, neutral face he used in sick rooms, and when Silas was finished, he sat back in his chair and interlaced his fingers and looked at Rosalie. "Tuesday," he said. "Tuesday," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "What exactly has been distributed? Can you give me a complete list?" She gave him one. From memory, without hesitation, every plant she had gathered, in what quantities, prepared in what forms, distributed to which families, and in what quantities. She recited it the way she had always catalogued things in her head, systematically, precisely, with the particular confidence of someone who has been paying attention to a subject for 23 years. When she finished, the doctor was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "You know," he said, "I went to medical school in Philadelphia, 4 years. I had one lecture on wild plants. One." He paused. "You know more than I do." "My grandmother taught me," she said, which she knew by now was her answer to everything, but it was the true one. "I'll speak to the county officer," he said. "I'll put it in writing if that's more useful." "It might be," Silas said. "Then I'll write it tonight." He looked at Rosalie steadily. "There's something else you should know. I've been doing some asking around about the other cases. The summer fever. There were 11 children in the county affected over August. Thomas Whitmore was the only one in Millhaven Valley." Rosalie waited. "The other 10, he said, all came from families who ate no wild greens whatsoever. All cultivated crops, standard diet." He paused. "The one child who recovered fastest in the Cartwell Township had a mother who had been giving him nettles in his broth for the week before the fever set in. She learned it from her own grandmother, apparently. Irish family." The room was very still. "You're saying the diet didn't cause it," Rosalie said. "I'm saying the diet almost certainly didn't cause it. And I'm saying there is some possibility, nothing I'd stake a medical degree on, nothing I'd publish, but a possibility, that what Thomas Whitmore was eating may have helped him." He paused. "The fever had broken before I expected it to." Silas let out a long breath. Rosalie said nothing. She was holding this information very carefully, the way you hold something fragile. Not squeezing it, not displaying it, just aware of its weight and its fragility. "Don't repeat that last part," Dr. Morse said. "Not yet. Not until I've done more asking. If I say something like that and I'm wrong, it does more harm than good." "I understand," Rosalie said, "but the first part, that the illness was county-wide, that it had nothing to do with your food, that I'll write in any letter you need." She nodded. "Thank you." They rode home in the late afternoon with the slant light on the fields and the harvest-dry smell of late August hanging in the air. Silas drove and Rosalie sat beside him, and they were quiet for most of the ride, which was not uncomfortable silence, but the kind that happens between two people after something has been accomplished, and the full shape of it is still being understood. "He thinks the food might have helped Thomas," Silas said, about a mile from home. "He said he might think that." "That's something." "It is," she said. "It's also nothing we can use yet, so we don't use it." Silas was quiet a moment. "You're very careful with information." "I've had to be," she said. He didn't answer that. She hadn't expected him to. What she hadn't said, what she didn't say to anyone that evening, was that hearing Dr. Morse say those words had done something to her she hadn't expected. She had spent 23 years gathering knowledge her grandmother had given her, had spent those years being told by everyone around her that the knowledge was eccentric at best and dangerous at worst. And now a doctor with a medical degree from Philadelphia was sitting across a desk from her and saying, very carefully, in his most professional voice, that she might be right about something. She thought she should feel vindicated. She mostly felt tired, which was, she supposed, the true shape of being proven right after a very long time. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the end of carrying something heavy, which was less exhilarating than expected and more like simply setting a weight down and noticing your arms were sore. She went to bed early that night. She slept better than she had in 2 weeks. Saturday brought another kind of problem entirely. It came in the form of Robert Crenshaw, not Pete, who had said things outside the Grange that Silas had declined to repeat, but his younger brother Robert, who was 19 and generally better-mannered, and who appeared at Rosalie's door just after noon with his hat in his hands and an expression of acute discomfort. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "my mother sent me." His mother was Hannah Crenshaw, who was 63 and had a bad hip, and lived in the original Crenshaw farmhouse, half a mile north of the Valley Road. Hannah had 3 sons and 1 daughter and had been a widow for 8 years and managed everything herself with the silent competence that Rosalie had always respected, even when their families moved in separate orbits. "What does she need?" Rosalie said. Robert turned his hat in his hands. "She's been real sick since Wednesday. Hip's worse and she's been in bed most of it. And we've been trying to... We haven't got a lot left in the stores, and Pete said..." He stopped. "Pete said not to come," Rosalie said. He looked at the door frame. "Yes, ma'am." "But your mother sent you anyway. She said to tell you she would have come herself if she could." Rosalie looked at this 19-year-old boy with his hat in his hands, caught between his older brother's pride and his mother's practical need, and felt the very specific exhaustion of being on the receiving end of other people's family dynamics when she had plenty of her own to manage. "Come in," she said. "I'll put something together." He came in and stood in the kitchen, looking like he was in a room he shouldn't be in. She put the kettle on and began assembling a parcel: soup, dried greens, the herbs she had prepared for hip complaints, which she knew from Mabel's experience of the previous winter could sometimes ease the inflammation without doing the damage that some of the harder remedies did. "Mrs. Mercer," Robert said while she worked. "My brother. What he said at the Grange about you. It's all right." "It isn't," he said. He said it with the plain directness of someone young enough to still say things plainly. "He was wrong. Ma told him so. She told him straight that we'd eaten your food 3 weeks ago, when you brought it, that we were all fine, and that a man who eats a woman's cooking and then stands up and questions her character in public is something lower than low." Rosalie stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "Her words," he said. He almost smiled. "She has strong feelings about hospitality." "Your mother," Rosalie said, "sounds like a woman worth knowing." "She always spoke well of you," Robert said. "Even when Pete was... She always said you were somebody who knew things most people didn't bother learning." Rosalie wrapped the parcel and tied it with a length of kitchen string. She thought about Hannah Crenshaw in the original farmhouse, half a mile north, managing 8 years of widowhood and 3 grown sons and 1 daughter with a bad hip and a good sense of how hospitality ought to work. "These herbs for the hip," Rosalie said. "I'll write down how to use them. Make sure she reads it, not just you. She needs to understand the amounts. Too much meadowsweet is rough on the stomach." "Yes, ma'am." "And tell your brother..." She paused, reconsidered. "Tell your mother I hope she's better soon." He took the parcel with both hands. At the door he stopped. "The county officer on Tuesday," he said. "Ma says if anyone speaks against you, she'll come herself, hip or no hip." After he was gone, Rosalie stood in her kitchen for a long moment with the quiet around her and thought about what an odd thing a community was. Full of people who were failing each other in specific ways, and occasionally, when forced to by sufficient crisis, doing something better than their worst impulses suggested they were capable of. She didn't have time to think about it longer than that. She had work to do. Sunday arrived with the particular combination of stillness and tension that Sunday in a small farming community carries when something is unresolved. The regular rhythms asserting themselves over the irregular fact of a coming reckoning. Rosalie did not attend the church service. She had never been an irregular attender, but she had also never been a faithful one, and this particular Sunday she judged the mathematics of walking into that room and having every eye in the valley on her to be unfavorable to her own composure. She needed her composure for Tuesday. She wasn't going to spend it on Sunday. She spent the morning at the creek, alone, which was unusual now. In recent weeks there had almost always been at least 2 or 3 women gathering with her, but which today felt necessary. She moved along the bank slowly, not harvesting with any urgency, just looking, cataloging, remembering what her grandmother's hands had looked like on these same kinds of plants. Different creek, different valley, same knowledge. She had been walking for about an hour when she heard someone on the bank behind her. She turned and found it was not one of the gathering women, and it was not Clara Whitmore, and it was not Agnes. It was Lenora Pike's eldest daughter, Frances. She was 16 and had her mother's narrow face, and, it turned out, not very much else of her mother's manner. She stood on the bank in good boots that had been unsuitably cleaned for creek walking and held a small basket in one hand with the tentative quality of someone who had brought equipment without being entirely sure they were supposed to be there. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. Rosalie waited. "Mama doesn't know I'm here," Frances said. All right, Rosalie said. The girl looked at the basket, then at the water, then at Rosalie. I want to learn. What you teach the others. The plants. She paused. Clara Whitmore told me about it. She's been showing me some things, but she said I should come to you because she's still learning herself, and she didn't want to teach me something wrong. Rosalie looked at this 16-year-old girl, Lenora Pike's daughter, standing on a creek bank in her good boots, asking to be taught the thing her mother had spent 10 years mocking. She thought about what the correct response to this moment probably was, from a variety of angles. What does your mother think you're doing right now? She said. Visiting Clara, Frances said, which was, technically, where she had come from. I didn't lie exactly. You didn't tell the whole truth exactly. No, ma'am. A pause. She'd have said no, if I'd asked. She probably would have, Rosalie agreed. Frances looked at her steadily. Mrs. Mercer, my father told me last night that there are families in this valley who wouldn't have made it through August if not for what you know. He said it quiet, so Mama didn't hear. But he said it. She paused. I want to know what you know, even if it takes a long time to learn. Rosalie looked at the girl for a long moment, at the basket, at the good boots already getting mud on them, at the expression on her face that was not her mother's composure, but something rawer and more honest and considerably more appealing. Put the basket down, Rosalie said. You're going to need both hands. She spent 2 hours with Frances on the bank. She showed her what she showed all the women she'd taught. The clusters, the stems, the smell, the feel of the leaf between two fingers. Frances paid the kind of attention that made a teacher's work feel worthwhile. She asked specific questions. She looked closely at things she was shown. She admitted when she didn't understand and asked again until she did. When they reached the stand of purslane that Rosalie had been harvesting heaviest, Frances crouched down and looked at it and said, Mama had this growing in the kitchen garden last year. She pulled it out, called it a weed. It is a weed, Rosalie said. Weeds are just plants that grow where they're not expected. Frances looked up at her. That's a good way to say it. My grandmother said it first, Rosalie said. I've been borrowing it ever since. They walked back along the bank as the afternoon light began shifting. At the point where the path split, Frances stopped. Mrs. Mercer, she said, I'm sorry. For things my mother has said. I know it isn't mine to apologize for, but I'm sorry anyway. Rosalie looked at her. You're right that it isn't yours, she said, but I'll take it in the spirit it's given. The girl nodded. She turned to go, then she turned back. The county officer on Tuesday, she said. Papa's going to speak for you. He already told Tom Aldridge. Rosalie stared at her. Henry Pike. Yes, ma'am. He said, Frances looked at the path. He said a man who lets his wife speak for the whole household when the household is wrong is a man who doesn't deserve the house. She walked away toward the valley with her basket and her muddy boots, and Rosalie stood on the creek bank and looked after her for a long time. Henry Pike, who had lived quietly beside his wife's ambitions for 20 years and said nothing, or nearly nothing, who had apparently been accounting for things in silence. She walked home slowly. Something was assembling itself in the air of this valley. She could feel it the way you feel a weather change, not seeing it yet, but knowing it's coming, knowing the pressure is shifting. She just didn't know whether it was shifting in her direction or away from it. Silas was mending harness at the kitchen table when she came in. He looked up. How was the creek? Interesting, she said. She sat down and told him about Frances Pike, about Henry Pike's intention. She watched his face as she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Henry Pike is a man who does what he's decided to do. If he said he'd speak, he'll speak. I know, she said. She stopped. It's what? It's complicated, she said. Frances is 16 and she wants to learn, and her father is going to stand up in front of a county official and say something decent about me. And Lenora is going to find out about both of those things, and whatever she's been managing inside that house is going to, She shook her head. It's not simple. You feel sorry for her, Silas said. He said it with some surprise. Rosalie considered. I feel something, she said. I'm not sure it's sorry. It's more like, I understand the shape of a person who has made themselves so rigid that any bend feels like breaking. I don't like Lenora Pike. I probably never will. but I understand something about what it costs to hold yourself that way. Silas looked at her across the table. You are a strange woman, he said. I mean that well. I know you do, she said. It's why I married you. He almost smiled. Almost. Then his expression shifted. The letters, he said. Rosalie, before Tuesday. I want to bring the letters to Tom Aldridge. Let him have them when the county officer comes. She harvested in the morning, processed in the afternoon, cooked in the evening, laid out her harvest records. She had been keeping them carefully since mid-August, a habit she'd started with no specific purpose and which now turned out to have a very specific purpose, and organized them at the kitchen table so they could be presented clearly if needed. She thought about her grandmother. She did this often, and usually it steadied her, but tonight it made her sad in the particular way that thinking about someone dead who is relevant to something happening right now makes you sad. The gap of them, the specific absence. Her grandmother had never been formally recognized for anything she knew. Had died in a farmhouse 2 counties east with her knowledge intact and completely outside any record that would outlast her. The only reason Rosalie had any of it was proximity. Accident of birth, accident of family, accident of being the granddaughter who was curious enough to follow her out into the early morning. She thought about Frances Pike on the creek bank with her muddy good boots, about Clara Whitmore at 14 with her small knife, about Agnes herself, who now walked the creek 3 mornings a week and could identify 6 plants with confidence and was working on a 7th. Whatever happened Tuesday, that wasn't going away. That was already in the hands of people who would carry it somewhere she couldn't follow. She put her records in order. She banked the fire. She checked the lock on the door and went to bed. She did not sleep easily. She lay in the dark and listened to Silas's breathing even out into sleep beside her and thought about all the things that could go wrong on Tuesday, cataloging them with the same systematic attention she gave to everything, because she had found that examining feared outcomes directly was less frightening than letting them move in the peripheral of her vision. The county officer might be sympathetic to the complaint. He might have opinions about women operating outside sanctioned knowledge systems. He might decide that formal action was warranted, which could mean what exactly? She wasn't sure. A fine, possibly. Some kind of prohibition. The word unauthorized in the complaint implied an authority that could either authorize or definitively decline to. She lay in the dark and let herself be afraid of these things for a measured amount of time. Then she categorized what she could control and what she couldn't, the way her grandmother had taught her to do. Not because it made the uncontrollable things go away, but because clarity about the boundary between controllable and not was itself a form of peace. She could control how she presented herself on Tuesday. She could control the organization of her records. She could control whether she let fear make her smaller than she actually was. She could not control the county officer. She could not control Lenora Pike. She could not control what Henry Pike would say, or whether he would come at all. What she could do, what she had always done, was show up knowing what she knew. She closed her eyes. She was asleep within minutes, which surprised her and probably shouldn't have. She had been putting everything she had into every day for 6 weeks. Her body had its own requirements and had stopped waiting for her permission to meet them. In this morning, she rose before light, put on her work clothes, and went to the creek. She was there when the first gray entered the sky and the water began to take on its daytime sound, and the birds started their morning inventory. She stood at the bank for a long time without harvesting, just standing, looking at what she saw when she looked at this place, the layers of it, the depth of what was there if you were willing to bend toward it and pay attention. Her grandmother's voice came back to her, as it did sometimes, in that particular way that wasn't quite memory and wasn't quite imagination. The plant doesn't ask you to be ready, it's just there when you are. She bent down and began to harvest. The morning was long, and the basket was full by the time she turned back toward home, and the valley was waking up around her with the ordinary sounds of families beginning their days. The close sound of livestock, the distant sound of a child's voice calling something she couldn't hear the content of. Tuesday was coming whether she was ready or not. She thought she was ready. She was not prepared for what happened before the county officer ever arrived. She was not prepared for Mabel Crow. Mabel Crow had not left her property in 14 months. This was not a secret exactly, but it was not something people discussed either. The way many things involving elderly people living alone tend to exist in a community's peripheral awareness. acknowledged in the vague sense that someone ought to check in more often, and largely unaddressed in the specific sense that nobody actually does. Rosalie had been the exception to this for the past year, but even she had not fully understood until this Tuesday morning, when she came up the valley road from the creek and found Mabel Crow standing at the edge of the road in front of her farmhouse, dressed in her good black coat and her church hat and holding a walking stick that Rosalie had never seen before. She stopped walking and stared. Mabel looked at her with the composed expression of someone who had made a decision and was not going to discuss it. "You're going the wrong way," Mabel said. "The Grange is north." "Mabel," Rosalie said, "what are you doing?" "I should think that's apparent." "You haven't been off this property since October of last year," Mabel said. "I'm aware of that. My hip is not ideal. The road is flat enough." She looked at Rosalie's basket. "You went to the creek this morning." "I did." "Good. Then you're ready." She nodded toward the north road. "Shall we?" Rosalie stood on the road looking at this 81-year-old woman in her good coat with her walking stick and felt something move through her chest that she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though it was adjacent to it. It was more like recognition. The particular feeling of being seen by someone who has no obligation to see you and sees you anyway. "Mabel," she said, "the meeting isn't until 10. It's barely 7. "I'm aware. I walk slowly now." A pause. "I used to walk very fast. It's aggravating." She looked down the north road. "Also, I wanted to get there before the valley does, so I can sit down." Rosalie fell into step beside her. They walked slowly, Mabel setting the pace with her stick, which was an unhurried pace but a determined one. The morning light was still low and golden on the harvested fields around them, and the air had the first edge of September in it. Not cold yet, but noticing that cold was coming. They didn't talk much on the walk. Mabel asked once how the creek had been, and Rosalie told her, and Mabel made a sound of satisfaction at the report of the wood sorrel patch. Then they walked in the companionable silence that had become their usual mode, and the valley road stretched ahead of them and the Grange Hall appeared at the end of it eventually, as things do when you walk toward them long enough. The Grange Hall was a long wooden building that served as the valley's meeting place for agricultural disputes, community decisions, and the occasional funeral reception when no other venue was large enough. It smelled like sawdust and old wool and the particular accumulated history of decisions made in it over 30 years, some of which had been good ones. Tom Aldridge was already there when they arrived, which meant he had been there for some time. There was a coffee pot on the side table that he had clearly made himself and a stack of papers on the main table that he was sorting with the focused energy of a man who has decided to be useful and has found a task to apply it to. He looked up when they came in, and his expression when he saw Mabel was almost comical. A rapid sequence of surprise, recalibration, and then a deep and genuine respect. "Mrs. Crow," he said. "Tom," Mabel said, "is there a chair without splinters in it?" He brought her the best chair in the room, the one usually reserved for whoever was running the meeting, and she sat in it without comment, which was its own form of acceptance, and set her walking stick across her knees and looked around the hall with the expression of someone conducting a private assessment. "You look like you're deciding where to put the furniture," Rosalie said. "I'm deciding where to stand," Mabel said. "When I speak, I want good light, and I want people to have to look at me directly." She pointed to a spot near the east window. "There." "Mabel," Rosalie said carefully, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Mabel said, with the particular finality of someone for whom that phrase has ceased to be a meaningful consideration. "I'm 81. I've been sitting in that house for 14 months. I have opinions, and I intend to express them while I still have the lung capacity to do so clearly." Tom Aldridge caught Rosalie's eye across the room, and she saw him press his lips together in the suppressed way of someone trying not to smile when smiling would be impolite. Harold Simmons arrived next, then Agnes Whitmore, then 2 of the Aldridge farmhands who had eaten Rosalie's food through August and apparently felt strongly enough about it to take a Tuesday morning away from work. Henry Pike arrived at 8:30, which was notable because he came alone. No Lenora, no daughters. And he sat down on the left side of the hall near the window and nodded at Rosalie when she looked at him and said nothing. Dr. Morse arrived at 20 minutes to 10 with his letter in a leather folder and his professional composure in its usual position, which was firmly in place but with something warmer than usual around the edges. He sat beside the main table and put the folder on it and looked at Rosalie. "How are you holding up?" he said. "I'm all right," she said. "You slept?" "Some." He nodded. "Good enough." He looked at Mabel in the good chair and the surprise crossed his face too. "Mrs. Crow, I'm glad to see you." "I should hope so," Mabel said. "I haven't seen you in 9 months. I've been fine before you ask. My hip is manageable. Don't fuss." "I wasn't going to fuss," he said. "You were about to. I can tell." He sat down with something that was definitely a suppressed smile, and Rosalie thought, watching the room fill slowly with the people who had come because they had decided to come, that this was a thing about communities that was easy to forget in the difficult weeks. They could surprise you. Not always, not reliably, not without having been pushed, but sometimes, under sufficient pressure, enough people found the better version of themselves to change the shape of things. She was still thinking about this when the county agricultural officer arrived. His name was Mr. Gerald Ames. He was perhaps 50, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent a career adjudicating rural disputes and had developed a professional neutrality that was not unkindness but was very carefully not warmth either. He came in with a younger man who appeared to be his assistant and a leather satchel and the manner of someone who had a schedule and intended to keep it. He sat up at the main table, Tom Aldridge's papers pushed respectfully aside, and surveyed the room with the assessing eye of a man who was quickly calculating what kind of meeting this was going to be. There were 17 people in the room. He had probably expected fewer. He looked at Rosalie. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "I'm Gerald Ames, Deputy Agricultural Officer for the county. I've received a written complaint regarding the distribution of non-certified food products in this valley. I'm here to gather information and determine whether formal action is warranted. This is not a trial. You are not required to have legal representation, though you're entitled to it if you wish." "I don't need it," Rosalie said. "All right." He folded his hands on the table. "Can you describe in your own words what you have been doing over the past 6 weeks?" She had prepared for this. She spoke clearly and without ornament. What she had gathered, where, in what quantities, prepared how, distributed to which families, over what period. She referenced her records, which she had brought, and set them on the table for him to examine. They were meticulous. She had been meticulous. 23 years of accumulated knowledge had trained her to document what she knew, because knowledge undocumented was knowledge that could be taken from you. He examined the records. His assistant made notes. The room was quiet. "You have no formal training in botany," Mr. Ames said. "Not formal, no," she said. "My grandmother taught me. I've been studying wild plants for 23 years. "Your grandmother had formal training?" "She had 40 years of practice," Rosalie said, "and her grandmother before her." He considered this. "The complaint suggests that plants were misidentified and possibly harmful." "Dr. Morse has prepared a statement," Rosalie said. Dr. Morse stood, opened his leather folder, and read the letter he had written the previous evening. It was precise and measured and covered 3 things: his examination of Rosalie's harvest, his assessment of her identification accuracy as regards every plant she had distributed, and his findings regarding the summer fever that had afflicted Thomas Whitmore and 10 other children across 3 townships during August. The letter stated clearly that the illness had been documented in families throughout the county with no connection whatsoever to wild plant consumption, and that the Millhaven case was medically indistinguishable from the broader pattern. When he finished, Mr. Ames read the letter himself. Then he set it down. "The complaint was signed," he said. He consulted his papers. "By Lenora Pike." The room shifted slightly. People looked at each other. Henry Pike, by the east window, looked at the table in front of him. "I have also received," Mr. Ames said, without apparent emotion, 3 letters of support for Mrs. Mercer's activities from Valley residents, as well as this letter from Dr. Morse." He looked up. "I understand there are people present who wish to speak." Tom Aldridge spoke first. He was not an eloquent man. He was a farmer who said what he meant in farmer's language, which is to say plainly and with a certain bluntness that could be either irritating or clarifying depending on your needs. He said that his family had eaten from Rosalie Mercer's harvest for 2 weeks, and were all present and healthy, and that in his view she had done more for the valley's survival than any government office had, and that formally penalizing her for it would be one of the more remarkable things he'd ever seen. Harold Simmons said something similar, and, as Silas had predicted, louder. Agnes Whitmore spoke more quietly. She talked about Thomas, about the fever and the doctor's careful face and the bone-set tea. She was not dramatic about it. She was just accurate, which in its own way was more devastating than drama. Then Henry Pike stood up. The room changed quality when he did. People who had been watching the main table looked at him. There was a particular weight to Henry Pike standing in the Grange Hall alone, without his wife, without the usual shelter of her more vocal presence, that everyone in the room could feel. He was not a tall man, and not a striking one. He had a farmer's face and a farmer's hands, and he had spent 20 years of marriage in the particular quiet of someone who has learned to wait for the moments that matter. "I want to say something," he said. "Not on behalf of my household, on my own behalf." He looked at Rosalie once, then looked at the agricultural officer. "My wife filed that complaint," he said. "I didn't know she was going to do it. I found out after. I'm not here to excuse it or explain it because I don't think I can do either of those things satisfactorily." He paused. "What I can say is that I watched what happened in this valley over the past 6 weeks, and I watched how people talked about Mrs. Mercer while they ate her food, and I thought, I've been quiet about things I should have spoken on for a long time. So I'm speaking now." He looked at the agricultural officer steadily. "Mrs. Mercer kept people from going genuinely hungry, not comfortably short of what they wanted hungry, but actually seriously hungry. She did it with knowledge most of us didn't have and were too proud to ask about until we had no other choice. She asked nothing in return. And when we turned around and questioned whether she might be harming us after eating her food, after taking what she knew, she didn't stop. She kept going." He paused. "If this county wants to formally penalize a woman for doing that, I'll be curious to see what it thinks it gains by it." He sat down. The room was very quiet. Mr. Ames made a note. His assistant made a note. The scraping of the pencils in the quiet was very audible. Then Mabel Crow stood up. She stood slowly and with effort, using her walking stick, and the effort was visible and she did not attempt to conceal it, which was its own kind of authority. She stood in the spot she had identified that morning near the east window, where the light was good, and she looked at the agricultural officer with the direct, clear gaze of someone who has been alive long enough to have stopped softening her assessments for the comfort of rooms. "My name is Mabel Crow," she said. "I am 81 years old. I have lived in this valley for 53 years. I have outlived my husband and both my sons, and I am still here." She paused, not for effect, but because she was making sure she had everyone's attention, which she did. "I want to tell you something about Rosalie Mercer." She looked at the room, not at Mr. Ames specifically, but at all of them, sweeping across the assembled faces with the kind of gaze that takes each person in individually. "This woman has come to my house every Thursday for the better part of a year," she said. "She has brought me food when I couldn't get it for myself. She has never once made me feel diminished for needing it. She has never once used my need to make herself feel generous or important. She just comes and she brings what I need, and she sits with me for a while, and then she goes back to her own work." She paused. "In August, when this valley was frightened and hungry and needed someone who knew something, she knew something. She shared it. She went without to make sure others had enough. And then this community turned around and treated her the way it had always treated her, which is to say poorly. And she kept going anyway." She looked directly at the agricultural officer now. "I did not come 2 miles on this hip this morning to watch a county official decide that what this woman did was a problem," she said. "I came to make sure someone in this room said plainly what the rest of these people are saying carefully." She straightened. "Rosalie Mercer did not harm this valley. She held it together. And if anyone in this county finds that problematic, they are welcome to come tell me so directly at my property, where I will have a great deal to say in response." She sat down. The room was silent for a moment that lasted longer than most silences. Then Harold Simmons started clapping. It was not the theatrical kind of applause. It was the slow, deliberate kind, the kind that means something, and several other people joined it, and the sound of it in the Grange Hall was not triumphant, but it was real. Mr. Ames waited for the room to settle. He looked at his papers. He looked at Dr. Morse's letter. He looked at Rosalie's records, which his assistant had been quietly reviewing throughout the proceedings. He looked at the room. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I have one more question." "Yes," she said. "In your 23 years of studying wild plants, Have you ever misidentified something? She looked at him steadily. Yes, she said. 3 times. None of the 3 were things I distributed to anyone. 2 I caught myself before harvesting. 1 I caught when Mrs. Crow noticed something I'd brought her and asked me a question that made me look at it again. She paused. I make mistakes. I caught them. That's part of the work. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at his assistant and something passed between them that was more efficiency than communication. I'm not going to recommend formal action, he said. The complaint as filed is not supported by the medical or documentary evidence before me. The distribution of wild plant food to Valley residents, as described and documented by Mrs. Mercer, does not meet the threshold for regulatory concern. He looked at the room. I will note in my report that the Valley's management of this summer's crop failure demonstrated significant community resourcefulness, and that the contribution of an individual with specialized traditional knowledge was material to the outcome. He closed his folder. That's all, he said. The room exhaled. It was not loud. It was the collective release of breath that a room full of people lets out when something has been resolved in the direction they hoped, which is a different sound than celebration. Rosalie sat very still. She had kept herself very still throughout the entire proceeding, because stillness was the thing she could control when everything else was in other people's hands, and she was not going to let this room see her hands shake. But now, in the aftermath of it, she felt the shaking trying to happen anyway, deep in her chest where it had been waiting. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs under the table and looked at the grain of the wood surface in front of her and breathed. Silas put his hand on her back. Just his hand, flat and warm, between her shoulder blades, the way you'd steady something you were afraid might tip. She straightened, nodded once, kept breathing. The room was beginning to move, people standing, talking, the formal quiet breaking into smaller conversations that had been waiting for this moment. Tom Aldridge shook Mr. Ames's hand with more enthusiasm than protocol probably required. Harold Simmons was already talking at full volume to no one in particular, which was his usual mode when pleased. Agnes came across the room and gripped both Rosalie's hands without saying anything, which was better than anything she could have said. Dr. Morse sat beside her and handed her the leather folder with his letter in it. Keep that, he said. Keep all of it. You think I'll need it again, she said. I think it's yours, he said simply. It belongs with your records. She took the folder. She added it to the stack of her own documents and held the whole thing in her lap and tried to be present in the room rather than somewhere in the middle distance where her mind kept trying to go. Henry Pike came to her before he left. He stood in front of her and she stood because it seemed wrong to remain seated, and they looked at each other for a moment. Mr. Pike, she said. Mrs. Mercer. He paused. I'm sorry. For my household. I know you'll say it isn't yours for me to apologize. I won't say that, she said. Thank you for what you said. It was honest and it cost you something, and I know it. He looked at the floor for a moment, then up. Frances came home with mud on her boots Sunday, he said. Rosalie looked at him. Good mud, he said. Creek mud. She had a basket full of purslane and she talked about it for the whole evening. He paused. She's never talked through a whole evening before. She takes after her mother, keeps things to herself. Something shifted in his face. It was good to hear her talk. Rosalie didn't know what to say to that, so she said what was true. She's a quick learner. She'll be better at this than I am in a few years if she stays with it. He nodded. He put on his hat and went to the door. He paused there. I don't know what happens at home from here, he said. He wasn't asking for reassurance. He was just saying it. Lenora she's a particular person. This isn't going to be easy. A pause. But it was right to come. Yes, Rosalie said. It was. He left. The door closed behind him. Rosalie thought about what was waiting for Lenora Pike at home. Her husband who had stood up in public and said what he said. Her daughter who was learning to walk creek banks. The formal complaint that had been publicly dismissed. The machinery of everything she'd constructed over 10 years, which had just taken a significant blow. She did not feel sorry in any comfortable way. What she felt was more complicated than that. A recognition that another person's reckoning was underway and that it was theirs to have, not hers to witness or interpret or take any satisfaction from. Lenora Pike's accounting with herself was her own business. What happened in that household from here was not something Rosalie could see into. and she found, standing in the clearing Grange hall, that she didn't need to. She had enough of her own. Mabel was still in the good chair when most of the room had emptied. She had accepted a cup of the coffee Tom Aldridge had made hours earlier without complaint, which told Rosalie she was tired, because Mabel had specific opinions about coffee and had expressed them to Rosalie on multiple occasions. Rosalie sat in the chair beside her and they were quiet together for a while. "Your hip," Rosalie said finally. "It'll survive," Mabel said. "I'll walk back with you." "I expected you would." Mabel looked at the coffee cup in her hands. "You gave a good accounting of yourself in there." "You gave a better one." "I'm older. I have the advantage of not caring what anyone thinks." "You care," Rosalie said. "You just care about the right things." Mabel considered this. "That's well put," she said, with the particular slightly surprised approval of someone who doesn't give compliments readily and expects the same in return. "That's well put." She looked at the east window where the light had moved significantly since morning. "Your husband. What about him?" "He put his hand on your back when the officer gave his decision." Rosalie said nothing. "A man who does that in a public room in 1887, Mabel said. That's a man who has decided something about himself." She paused. "It took him a while." "Most worthwhile things do," Rosalie said. They sat until Mabel was ready to stand, which took longer than either of them acknowledged, and then Rosalie gave her her arm, and they walked out of the Grange hall into the September light. Silas was waiting outside. He had brought the wagon, which Rosalie had not asked him to do, and which was, she thought, his practical way of saying everything Henry Pike had said explicitly inside the hall. He helped Mabel up with a care and steadiness that surprised the old woman into a look of brief, unguarded gratitude. "Silas Boone," she said, "you're more useful than you look." "Thank you, Mrs. Crow," he said. "I think." The ride back to Mabel's house was slow, and the road was dry, and the September light was still golden. Mabel sat in the wagon bed on the folded blanket Silas had put there and looked at the fields going past with the expression of someone who has been inside too long and is recalibrating their sense of the world's actual size. "The valley looks different from here," she said, not to either of them specifically. "You've been inside a while," Rosalie said. "I can see where the beetles were," Mabel said. "You can see it in the color of the soil, whole sections." She was quiet for a moment. "And the creek banks. You can see from here where it's full, where you've been working." Rosalie looked. She could see it too, the untouched green of the creek margins against the dry harvest color of the fields. The plants that had simply continued regardless of beetles and drought and county complaints and anonymous letters. There in the margins where nobody had planted them, where nobody had tended them, where they had survived every previous summer because survival in the margins does not require permission. They left Mabel at her house with the promise of Thursday's visit and Rosalie's instruction that the crock had better be empty. Mabel told her to stop hovering. Rosalie told her to eat the soup. It was their language, and it meant something specific between them, and both of them knew it. On the ride back, Silas and Rosalie sat side by side on the wagon seat in the way they had sat 1,000 times before, with the familiar distance between them that was not estrangement but just the practical gap of two people who know each other well enough to not need to be pressed together. After a while, Silas said, "It's over then." "The complaint is," she said. He glanced at her. "What isn't?" She thought about it. About the families who still needed feeding before the winter stores were established. About the women who were still learning the creek and needed more time with her before they knew enough to go without her. About what Dr. Morse had said carefully in his office. That the food might have helped Thomas, that he didn't know yet, that he was still asking around. About Mabel's crock that needed to be emptied by Thursday. "The work," she said. He nodded, like he'd expected that answer. He probably had. They rode home through the afternoon, and the fields went past on both sides with their harvest-dry beauty, and in the margins all along the road the wild plants continued their ungoverned, persistent growing. At the edge of their own property, Silas stopped the wagon and sat a moment before he clicked at the horses again. "Rosalie," he said. "Yes." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Those men at the Grange, this summer. I should have done what Henry Pike did, sooner." She looked at his profile, at the lines in his face that were deeper than they'd been in the spring, at his hands on the reins. "You came around," she said. "Late," he said. People do, she said. It's still worth something, coming around. He didn't answer that. He clicked at the horses and they moved up the lane toward the farm, and the late afternoon settled around them. And somewhere along the creek, the wild things went on growing in the way they always had, quietly, in the margins, without anyone's permission and without anyone's help, and utterly indifferent to whether the valley noticed them or not. But the valley was beginning to notice, and that, Rosalie thought, watching her house come into view, was where the real work was about to begin. The real work, as it turned out, looked almost exactly like the work that had come before it, which was, Rosalie thought, probably the truest thing about most important undertakings, that the moment of recognition, when it finally arrives, doesn't change what needs doing. It just changes who's willing to do it alongside you. The week after the Grange meeting, she had 11 women at the creek. Not 2, not 3, not the careful trickle of the desperate and the quietly curious that had built through August. 11. Women who had been gathering for weeks already, and women who were entirely new to it, women who had eaten her food and said nothing, and women who had said things they were now choosing to move past by showing up with baskets and sensible boots, and the particular determined expression of people who have decided that action is more useful than apology. Rosalie stood at the bank and looked at them and felt something complicated, not the clean, simple gratitude that a tidier story would have given her. Something more mixed than that. The genuine warmth of being joined, threaded through with the memory of where each of these women had been in the 3rd week of August, and the honest acknowledgement that she was going to have to hold both things at once for a long time. She had made her peace with complexity years ago. This was just more of it. All right, she said. We start with what you can eat and what will kill you. They sometimes look very similar, and that is the first thing you need to understand about wild plants. Martha Tillman, who had been gathering for several weeks already and considered herself moderately advanced in this education, nodded with perhaps slightly more confidence than her actual knowledge warranted. Clara Whitmore, beside her, had a notebook. Frances Pike had brought the same basket she'd carried to the creek on Sunday, now properly broken in with use. 2 of the newer women had clearly just purchased their baskets that week, the handles still stiff and the weave unscuffed. Rosalie walked them through it. She had been doing this long enough now that she knew which parts needed slowing down and which parts people absorbed quickly, knew when a question was genuine confusion and when it was someone covering for the fact that they weren't looking closely enough. She was patient in the way of someone who has a limited supply of patience and has learned to allocate it carefully rather than performing an unlimited quantity she didn't have. It took 2 hours. By the end of it, the women with the new baskets had filled them, which was the real test. Being able to look at a stretch of creek bank and find what was there rather than seeing only undifferentiated green. On the walk back, Agnes fell into step beside her. Thomas had been fully recovered for nearly 2 weeks now and had returned to his previous occupation of collecting rocks and depositing them in his mother's pockets, and Agnes had the particular lightness of someone recently released from a long fear. "Rosalie," she said, "the County Agricultural Society. Tom Aldridge mentioned they're looking for someone to address the November meeting. He suggested you." Rosalie glanced at her. "Tom suggested that. And Dr. Morse and Harold Simmons." Agnes paused. "And I did, when they asked if anyone had ideas." Rosalie looked at the path ahead. The November meeting of the County Agricultural Society was not a small thing. It drew farmers from 3 townships, people with standing and resources, people who made decisions about what the county's agricultural future looked like. It was not a place where a woman had previously been invited to address the room. "It's not a done thing," Agnes said quickly. "Nobody's extended a formal invitation, but Tom thinks if you're willing, he can make it happen." "I'll think about it," Rosalie said. "That means yes," Agnes said. "It means I'll think about it," Rosalie said, but she said it with enough of something in her voice that Agnes accepted it as the yes it probably was. She did think about it. She thought about it for 3 days, which was longer than she usually gave decisions, and what she thought about was not whether she was capable of it or whether she had anything worth saying. Those questions had been answered in ways she was still processing. What she thought about was what she would actually say, what the shape of it would be, what a room full of county farmers in November needed to understand that they didn't already. On Thursday, she walked to Mabel's house and found the crock from the previous visit empty, which she pretended not to be surprised by, and while Mabel ate the soup she'd brought, she told her about the November meeting. Mabel listened without interrupting, which was unusual. When Rosalie finished, she set her spoon down. "What are you going to say to them?" she said. "That's what I've been working on," Rosalie said. "Start with the beetles," Mabel said. "Not the plants. The beetles." Rosalie looked at her. "The plants don't mean anything to them until they understand what the beetles took," Mabel said. "Start with what was lost. Then show them what was there that couldn't be lost." She picked her spoon back up. "Men who farm for a living understand scarcity. Start where they live." "That's good," Rosalie said. "I know it is," Mabel said. She walked home thinking about beetles and margins and what it means to build something that can survive what it can't control, and by the time she reached her own door, she had the shape of it. Silas was in the kitchen when she came in. He had been spending more evenings in the kitchen recently rather than in the barn with the theoretical repairs that had previously occupied most of his after-dinner hours. And while neither of them had commented on this directly, it had changed something in the house. The temperature of it, maybe. The quality of the evenings. "Tom Aldridge came by," he said. "About November." "I know, Agnes told me." He looked at her carefully. "Will you do it?" "I think so," she said. She sat down. "I need to figure out what I'm actually saying." "Tell them what you told me," he said. She looked at him. "What did I tell you?" He thought about it. "You told me the plants were there before anyone needed them and they'd be there after. You told me the creek bank didn't care whether the valley respected it. You told me knowledge that lives in one person is knowledge one illness away from being lost." He paused. "You didn't say it exactly like that. You said it while you were sorting nettles, and you weren't looking at me." She was quiet for a moment. "I said that," she said. "You said that," he confirmed. She looked at this man she had been married to for 11 years. This man who had come around late, who had stood by the wagon with his reasons, instead of in the room beside her for longer than she would have liked, who had put his hand between her shoulder blades in the Grange hall at the exact moment she needed something to hold on to, who had apparently been listening across all those evenings more carefully than she had known. "Silas?" she said. "Yeah. Thank you, for the Grange, for what you said to Pete Crenshaw." "I should have said it sooner," he said. The same thing he kept saying, which she supposed meant he was still working through it. "You said it," she said. "That's the part that counts." He looked at the table. "The things people said about you. This summer. Before." He stopped. "I let them say it. Too long." "Yes," she said. She didn't soften it. He didn't need it softened. "I'm sorry for that," he said. Simply. Without the qualifications that people usually attach to apologies when they were more interested in feeling forgiven than in actually accounting for something. She looked at him for a long moment. 11 years. The complicated arithmetic of it. "I know," she said. "I believe you." It wasn't a clean resolution. There was no version of it that was clean. But it was honest, and honest was what they had always done best between them when they were doing their best, and she thought it would hold. October came in with the first cold, and the valley made its uneasy peace with what the summer had been. The harvest was poor by any normal measure. The root vegetables had survived reasonably. The wild stores Rosalie had accumulated were substantial, and between the two and the careful rationing that most families had been practicing for 6 weeks, the community entered the fall in a state that was not comfortable but was survivable, which was, Rosalie had learned, a different and more important thing than comfortable. The women kept coming to the creek through October, though the group shifted as the weather changed. Some dropped off, families with enough stored and enough work without adding a new skill to October's already long list. Others stayed. Clara Whitmore stayed. Frances Pike stayed every Saturday morning, appearing at the bank in progressively better broken-in boots, with her notebook increasingly filled. Frances never mentioned her mother directly. Rosalie never asked. What was happening in the Pike household was a matter between the people inside it, and Rosalie's window into that particular interior had always been limited, and was probably better that way. But one Saturday in mid-October, Frances arrived at the creek with a small jar of preserved lamb's quarters that she had dried and put up herself, following the method Rosalie had shown her, and she offered it to Rosalie with the slightly too casual manner of someone who has put more care into something than they want to admit to. Rosalie opened it and smelled it and nodded with the genuine appreciation of someone who could assess work, and was looking at work done well. "Good color," she said. "Good seal." "I did 3 jars," Frances said, with the same too casual manner. Mama found one. Rosalie looked at her. What did she say? Frances was quiet for a moment. She didn't throw it away, she said, which was clearly the relevant part. Rosalie handed the jar back. Take it home, she said. Put it in the kitchen where she can use it. Frances looked at her. Something moved in the girl's face. She might not. She might not, Rosalie agreed, but it'll be there. There was something in that exchange that Rosalie thought about for several days afterward. Not with any particular conclusion, she was past expecting conclusions from Lenora Pike, but with the recognition that sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do is simply make something available and then leave it alone. You couldn't reach into someone else's interior and rearrange it. All you could do was put something true and useful within their reach and let them decide. She had spent 11 years trying to do that with Silas. It had taken a long time and not without cost, but it had taken. She was not holding her breath for Lenora Pike, but she wasn't closing the door either. The November meeting of the County Agricultural Society was held on a Tuesday evening, which was the same day of the week as the Grange hearing, a coincidence that Rosalie noticed and then deliberately set aside because she didn't need the comparison adding to the weight of the evening. The hall was larger than the Grange, a proper meeting room in the county seat, 12 miles from Millhaven Valley, with a long central table and rows of chairs that filled with men as the evening came on. Farmers mostly, some with wives, some with older sons. The county agricultural officer, Mr. Ames, was there, which Rosalie had not expected. He sat near the back and gave no indication when she came in that he knew her, which she took as professional neutrality rather than deliberate coldness. Tom Aldridge was there, and Harold Simmons and Dr. Morse. Silas sat in the second row. He had put on his good coat, which he wore only for significant occasions, and the fact that he was wearing it here meant something that she took in and stored without commenting on. The society's chairman, a broad-shouldered man named Arthur Weil, who had been farming the county for 40 years, introduced her with the careful neutrality of a man who was presenting something unusual and was not entirely sure how the room was going to take it. Mrs. Rosalie Mercer, he said, of Millhaven Valley, who has agreed to speak this evening on the subject of wild plant resources and their role in this summer's crop failure recovery. She stood at the front of the room and looked at approximately 60 faces looking back at her and felt the specific quality of the silence that a room produces when it's reserving judgment. She had felt it before, at the Grange, and at various other thresholds of her life. She was not comfortable in it. She was practiced at it, which was different. She thought of Mabel. Start with the beetles. In the first week of August, she said, the beetle infestation that moved through this county destroyed, by my estimate, 60 to 70% of Millhaven Valley's cultivated crop. I watched my husband walk his fields, and I saw what that kind of loss does to a man who has done everything right. I imagine most of you in this room either lived through something similar this summer or know someone who did. The room was listening. She could feel it listening. 3 days after the beetles arrived, she said, I was at the creek bank, which was unaffected, because wild plants were not what the beetles were looking for. Because wild plants that have grown in the margins for generations without human cultivation have developed a resilience that our cultivated crops, bred for yield and flavor and nothing else, do not have. She paused. Let that land. What I want to talk to you about tonight is not remarkable, she said. It is the opposite of remarkable. It is the most ordinary thing in the world, which is that the things we overlook are not absent. They are right there, in the margins, along the creeks and the fence lines and the edges of fields that we have been walking past without seeing for as long as we've been farming this county. She talked for 40 minutes. She had never talked for 40 minutes in front of a room in her life, but she didn't feel the length of it because the material was 40 minutes long and she was saying what needed saying at the pace it needed to be said. She talked about specific plants and where they grew and what they provided and how to identify them safely and how to preserve them. She talked about the families she had fed and the quantities she had harvested and the yield she had gotten from the creek margins without depleting them. She talked about what it would mean for every farm in the county to have one person, ideally two, who could walk a creek bank and see it as a resource rather than a boundary. She talked about her grandmother. She didn't talk about her grandmother in the sentimental way. She talked about her as a source of information, as a repository of knowledge that had been entirely unrecorded and was now partially recorded in Rosalie's own head and in the notebooks of a 14-year-old girl in Millhaven Valley and several other women who had been coming to the creek on weekday mornings since August. She talked about what it means for knowledge to live in one person and what is lost when that person is gone. She did not talk about the letters. She did not talk about the Grange hearing or the complaint or the community's behavior in the third week of August. Those were not the point, and she had decided some time ago that making herself the subject of her own argument was a waste of everybody's time. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and then Arthur Weil asked if there were questions. And there were questions, quite a few of them, and they were good questions. Specific, practical, the questions of people who were actually thinking about what she'd said rather than just waiting to respond to it. A man in the third row asked how long it had taken her to learn to identify plants reliably. "Years," she said. "I started at 11. I made mistakes through my 20s. I'm still learning." She paused. "But you don't need to know everything to start. You need to know 5 plants well enough to harvest safely. 5 plants is a winter's difference in most households." Another man asked about the time investment, whether a farming family already at maximum capacity could reasonably add this to what they were doing. 2 hours a week at the creek, she said. Once you know what you're looking for, less time than most families spend addressing the consequences of not knowing. The man thought about it, nodded, wrote something down. Mr. Ames from the back row raised his hand. "Mrs. Mercer, would you be willing to provide the society with written documentation of your identification methods? A guide of some kind?" She looked at him. "I would," she said. "We'd be interested in distributing it," he said, "officially, through the county office." She held his gaze for a moment. 4 weeks ago, this man had been sitting at a table in the Grange Hall, deciding whether to take formal action against her for doing exactly what she had just spent 40 minutes describing to a room full of county farmers. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had been given a particular lens through which to see things, and like most people, had been using that lens until something gave him cause to look around it. "All right," she said, "I'll write it." Arthur Weil thanked her when the questions ran out. He did it with the particular formality of someone who is not accustomed to being surprised and is not entirely sure how to acknowledge that he has been. So he reaches for the standard form and applies it more carefully than usual. "The society appreciates your contribution," he said. And then, after a slight pause, "Mrs. Mercer, what you did for your valley this summer, it was significant. I hope that has been said plainly enough, in enough rooms, by enough people." She thought about whether it had been. Whether the Grange hearing and Henry Pike's straight accounting and Harold Simmons's volume and Mabel in the good chair by the east window constituted enough rooms and enough people. "It's getting there," she said. Silas drove them home in the dark. The 12 miles back to Millhaven Valley passed in the quiet that followed things that mattered, the kind of quiet that had substance to it. Rosalie sat in the cold night air and looked at the dark fields going past and felt something she was still learning to name. Not satisfaction exactly, because satisfaction implied an ending, and this was not an ending. More like the particular solidity that comes from having done something correctly in public and knowing that the record now reflected it. "You were good in there," Silas said. "I was accurate," she said. "Sometimes they're the same thing." She looked at the sky. The September dryness had broken in October and the fields smelled like themselves again. Wet earth and root and the particular promise of things that had gone underground to wait. "I'm going to write the guide," she said, "for the county. It'll take most of the winter." "I know," he said. "I'll help." She turned and looked at him. "You'll help." "With the writing. You tell it and I'll put it down. Your handwriting is bad." "My handwriting is not—" She stopped. "My handwriting is not ideal," she admitted. "It's terrible," he said. "I've been reading it for 11 years. I know what it costs." She laughed. It came out more freely than she expected it to. The air was cold on her face and the wagon was familiar under her, and Silas was beside her with his bad handwriting joke and his good coat, and she thought that this was something to hold on to, this specific ordinary moment moving through the dark. Because the good moments were often small and always in motion, and the only way to have them was to notice them while they were happening. "Silas," she said. "Yeah. Come to the creek with me tomorrow morning." He was quiet for a moment. "The creek." "I want to show you something," she said. "There's a stand of wintercress I found last week. It's going to come in strong before the first hard frost, and I want someone else to know where it is." He was quiet another moment. "Early?" "Before light," she said. "You know how I go." He thought about this with the visible effort of a man who values his sleep and is making a decision about something more than sleep. "All right," he said. She turned back to the dark road ahead. She thought about all the things she would have to teach him. Not just Silas, but the valley, but the county. The slow and unglamorous and repetitive work of transferring knowledge from one set of hands to another without losing anything essential in the transfer. It was the longest project she had ever undertaken, and it had no clear endpoint, and it would outlast her in ways she couldn't fully imagine. Her grandmother had understood this, had walked out in the early mornings not knowing which grandchild, if any, would carry it, had just kept walking. Rosalie would keep walking. In the spring, when the planting season came back around and the valley took stock of itself after its first winter with changed knowledge, three things happened that were noted by people who paid attention to what the valley was becoming. The first was that 7 families planted deliberate wild corners in their properties, small, unmowed sections along fence lines and creek borders where wild plants could establish themselves within easy reach. It was Rosalie's suggestion, passed through the gathering women, and then through their husbands, and then through the kind of slow community adoption that looks like consensus, but is actually accumulated individual decisions. The second was that Clara Whitmore, who had turned 15 over the winter, taught the first gathering walk herself. Rosalie had watched from a distance, deliberately, letting the girl lead without the safety net of a more experienced voice behind her. Clara had made one error. She'd identified a stand of bittercress as watercress and had caught herself before anyone harvested it. She had stopped, looked again, corrected herself out loud, and explained the difference. Rosalie, watching from behind a stand of willow, thought that catching your own mistake in front of people was a more advanced skill than not making the mistake in the first place. The third thing was smaller. Lenora Pike came to the creek, not with the gathering group, not on a Saturday morning when Francis was there. She came on a Thursday morning alone, when the bank was empty except for Rosalie. Rosalie was harvesting early lamb's quarters, the first tender shoots of the spring crop, and she heard someone coming along the bank and turned and found Lenora standing 10 feet away in practical boots that had seen actual use, holding no basket but carrying herself with the particular careful composure of someone who has rehearsed this moment and is now in it and finding it different from the rehearsal. They looked at each other. "Rosalie," Lenora said. First name. In 10 years of neighboring, it was possibly the first time. "Lenora," Rosalie said. Lenora looked at the bank, at the plants, at Rosalie's harvest laid in the basket. She was silent for a moment that was not comfortable but was, Rosalie thought, at least honest. "Francis knows more than I do," Lenora said. "About this," a gesture toward the bank. "She's been teaching her sister, in the kitchen, using those jars she put up." Rosalie waited. "Henry thinks I should—" Lenora stopped, revised. "I want to learn," she said. "If you'll teach me." Rosalie looked at this woman, the letters in the box on the high shelf, the Grange Hall in August, the county complaint with a name on it, Frances on the creek bank in her good boots asking not to be turned away for her mother's choices. She thought about what she wanted to say, which was complicated and various. She thought about what was worth saying. "Can you be here at 6 Thursday morning?" she said. Something moved through Lenora's composure, a slight loosening. "Yes," she said. "Bring a basket," Rosalie said. "Wear boots you don't mind ruining." She turned back to her harvest. Behind her she heard Lenora standing for another moment, and then the sound of her walking back along the bank, and then the creek moving in the ordinary way it moved, which was without comment on what had just happened, and without expectation of what would come next. That was the creek's way. It had no use for resolutions. It just continued. Rosalie continued too. She finished the morning's harvest with her hands in the cold spring water and her knees wet from kneeling and the basket full of the season's first real abundance. And she thought about her grandmother and what she would have made of all of it. The county guide being printed in the agricultural office, the 7 wild corners along the valley's fence lines, Clara Whitmore teaching herself how to correct her own mistakes, Silas's handwriting filling up the winter notebooks beside hers. She thought her grandmother would not have been surprised. She had always believed that knowledge, once given, goes somewhere. That you couldn't always see where it went or how fast or in what form it arrived when it got there, but that the giving was never wasted. Rosalie believed this too. She had believed it through August and the Beatles and the letters and the Grange Hall and all of it, and she believed it more specifically now, which was different from believing it in the abstract. She stood up from the bank with her basket and her wet knees and her cold hands, and she looked at the creek, the way she had looked at it every morning for years, not with ownership, not with sentiment, just with the clear-eyed attention of someone who knows what's here and is grateful for the knowing. Then she walked home through the spring morning to start the work of the day, which was the same work as yesterday and the work of tomorrow and the work she would be doing in some form until she wasn't anymore, and which was, in the end, the only real answer she had ever found to the question of what a life should be used for. You find what others overlook, you learn it well enough to trust it, and when the time comes, you pass it on.